All right, so hello everyone. For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Catherine Rigg. I'm the Senior Marine Planner for the Haida Oceans Technical Team, or HOT, as we are commonly known locally, which after 2 days of being buried under acronyms, I expect you to remember. If you can't remember UNCLOS and ERTV and SOLAS and everything, remember the Haida Oceans Technical Team, HOT. This is the time slot that no one else wanted. It's the afternoon of day 2. It's after lunch, and everybody tends to be a little bit tired and slower, perhaps, than usual. And so we decided to shake things up a little bit and frame the issue of community engagement as a mock debate, or, as we like to call it amongst the three of us, a spirited discussion. We initially actually discussed framing this or modeling this after the CBC radio show, The Debaters, complete with the bare knuckle round and the firing line and everything. But after this week's sort of Elizabeth May debacle and the humble realization that none of us are professional comedians, we thought common sense prevailed, and we really thought that we were better off sparing you the pain, because while it might have ended up being absolutely hilarious, it was more likely to be a very painful experience for everybody in the room. So rather than that, we've decided we're going to sort of approach the issue of community engagement as more of a standard back and forth debate about the pros and cons. And we have 2 game representatives who are going to shed some light on this important issue. Mark Swanson, to my right here, is the executive director of the PWSRCAC, or the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council. There you go. I had to memorize that. Mark has a background with the U.S. Coast Guard. He also was a naval architect. He worked as an emergency response manager for Shell Oil. And he also worked with the international ship classification group, Lloyd's Registry. So he's a man who has worn many hats, and he's bringing that collective experience here to share with us today. And he will be advocating in favor of community engagement. Stafford Reid, to Mark's right, has the dubious honor of advocating against community engagement, and we are very grateful he's the only one who we thought would be game to do it, and we really appreciate that he is. Stafford is the principal consultant with EnviroEmerge Consulting, and EnviroEmerge focuses on emergency training, environmental emergency training, and spill risk analysis. He specializes in developing response plans, guidelines, and agreements for major oil and hazardous material spills on the Pacific coast. And knowing Stafford, and those of you who've been in groups with Stafford already, he's probably the only consultant who wouldn't follow consulting advice and would just say or think whatever he wants to say. So we think he's a wonderful person to really provide sort of the devil's advocate position on community engagement to a certain extent. I want to be very clear that this is not about pointing, this framework is not about pointing fingers at anybody or anything like that. It's really just about showing the pros and cons of different ways of approaching emergency response and accident prevention. So to explain a little bit about how this will work, first we'll start with Mark, who will have 10 minutes to advocate to basically make the case for community engagement. That will be followed by 10 minutes with Stafford providing the counter argument. And then they will have 3 minutes each to address the other's points and make a compelling wrap-up argument. After that, we will deviate from the debate kind of structure and open the floor to questions. So please hold on to them if something they say triggers a thought or a question in your mind, hold on to them to that point, and we'll allow you to ask questions of both sides. I think it would be interesting in most cases probably to have an answer that from both of these talented and very experienced individuals. So with that introduction, I think we'll dive right in, and I will introduce the resolution before us today. Whereas resources and capacity to prevent and respond to marine emergency incidences is limited, be it resolved that communities be actively involved in both accident prevention and emergency response activities. With that, I'm going to invite Mark up to the podium here, and you have 10 minutes to speak on this very controversial topic.
Well, first of all, thanks to the Haida Nation for the invite, and maybe a more tenuous thanks to Kathy for throwing me into a debate format. But I'm going to start just with a little simple explanation of what citizen oversight is, or how this works. And I want you to imagine two teenagers, a young man and a young woman in a car, and maybe they haven't had their driver's license very long, and the young man's trying to show off, and maybe he's driving a little fast, he's a little proud of his car, wants to show how well it works off-road, and maybe do all kinds of risky things in the attempt to impress the young lady in the car. Now let's put one of their parents in the back seat. Where's the parent been? The parent has an educated idea of all the horrible things that could go wrong in this scenario, and not really impressed by bad driving, not really impressed by risk-taking, and kind of puts a wet blanket over the party. And I think that's really what citizens oversight is really about. We're the wet blanket on the party, because we've been there, and frankly, what citizens oversight does is it gives the potential victims of an accident a seat at the table, a voice, and it's an educated voice. And so that's pretty important. And I don't want to disparage risk-taking. Risk-taking is really important. We value risk-takers in our society. The hunter that brings back, the best game is often the one that goes deepest in the woods, and the fisherman that does the best goes where the fish are, and often at times that's in harm's way. That's really important. But let's be clear, we've advanced technologically beyond the hunter and the fisherman, and so now we reward oil companies for going further and deeper and finding oil in hard to get places. But when they take risks, they don't bear the cost. You bear the cost. We bear the cost. And so when those risks don't get managed well, entire ecosystems can get trashed. And so the victims need a voice. Think about mothers against drunk drivers. I don't know if you were familiar with that concept in Canada, but when you put victims, as part of the conversation, it changes the conversation, and that's really important. So the other concept there is, how does this work? It's advisory. It's advisory only. So the key attributes of a citizens advisory group is it has to be independent, and so we don't really get a lot of direction from the oil industry. We don't get a lot of direction from the regulators, but we do have a seat at the table and are allowed to provide advice. We have secure funding. That's really, really important, because if we're just funded by the taxpayer, that's not really a good model. The best model really is that the folks that earn a profit while visiting a risk on the private citizen's backyard really need to be paying for the citizens to be engaged. And so secure funding is pretty important. Access, we have access similar to regulators to the industrial facility we look at, and in Prince William Sound, that's the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Terminal and the associated tankers. But it really could be any industrial activity, any resource extraction activity, any activity that visits risks on you. You've got shipping, transiting, how many ships a year are going by, Haida Gwaii here. That's pretty important. And so access to that information, to those records. And then the last sort of really key fundamental for this to work is the ability to do independent research. So that's pretty important. So in my structures, I have a board of directors, and that's really what gives me the credibility. My board of directors are the folks that got pasted by the Exxon Valdez oil spill. So I have 9 sort of conventional communities, cities, boroughs, that sort of stuff. I represent 7 tribal communities or tribal villages, IRA councils, 1 tribal corporation, 1 environmental seat, 1 chamber of commerce seat, and 1 recreational seat. And so what that really means is when I go talking to industry, when I go talking to the regulators, I'm not representing the R's or the D's or the conservatives or the liberals. I'm really representing, a lot of folks that work for the oil industry. And so, a lot of misperceptions is that we're anti-industry. We're not anti-industry at all. We want the industry to succeed. But we have a much more enlightened, idea of success. And success really avoids, it means avoiding an oil spill. If you were a member of the board of directors for BP, I think you might have a different view about shortcuts. Maybe you save some money in the short term, but, it really costs the company in the long term. And so I try to, if you look at the bookends of public participation, we're not a watchdog and we're not a lapdog. We're somewhere in between. And I'll describe, kind of the happy medium where we try to sit as credible advisors, because we're really in the advice business. A watchdog is a lot of the NGOs, a lot of the environmental folks that get pretty shrill and often come across as just anti-industry. And so they, like a watchdog, like a real watchdog, they bark at everything, and not everything needs to be barked at, and they don't often recognize when industry is doing a truly great job, or the best that anybody knows how to do anyway, in some circumstance. And so a lot of NGOs kind of fall in that watchdog role. And we're not a lapdog, and a lot of what most of you may know as advisory councils are lapdogs, and they're, advisory groups convened either by industry, to, where they cherry pick their advisors, or by the government. And so the government gets to pick who sits on those, and they often end up being a cheerleader, or a bullhorn, if you will, to yay, yay, rah, rah, what those groups are doing. So we're not either of those. We kind of fit in the middle. The Congress had two objectives for setting up an advisory council, and one is to replace mistrust with collaboration and cooperation. And that sounds great, and sounds like motherhood and apple pie, and we're all going to sing Kumbaya. But the other objective was to push back and fight complacency. And nobody's going to fight complacency year in, year out, decades, like the folks that were affected, like the potential victims, like the folks that really understand consequence. And so we do both of those. And so, there's a long list of successes, and I think I've got about a minute left here, but...
No, you got 4.
I have 4 minutes. Okay, so I'm kind of if you're from Oklahoma, it's it's the show me state, right? So don't tell me, show me. And so what's the legacy of citizens sitting down day after day, year after year, having these uncomfortable but respectful conversations with industry and with government officials and regulators? The legacy of success in prevention and response, is arguably among the best preparedness and response posture in the world in Prince William Sound. We have over 400 fishing vessels that are on retainer. They're not vessels of opportunity. These are real vessels that drill and practice every year with real response equipment, and they know their waters. We have tanker escorts. All the tankers going, in Prince William Sound, when they've got cargo on board, they have escorts on board. And those aren't just any escorts. They're some of the most powerful tugs on the West Coast, some of the most powerful tugs in this hemisphere. And they're purpose-built, and they're purpose-designed for that purpose, to arrest and save a tanker. There are weather limits on when vessels can move. There's ice risk information. There's 20 years of environmental monitoring, knowing what's out there, what the hydrocarbons are in the environment. There's air quality progress, vapor controls on ballast water, vapor controls on loading. All of those, resulting in like a 98% reduction in BTXs, benzenes, toluenes, xylenes in the air. There's work on non-indigenous species. There's political and environmental advocacy, adding dollars to the federal budget when the Coast Guard's on the chopping block, adding dollars to the budget when the state agency, ADEC, is on the chopping block. We have best available tankers. We have best available spill response. We have the best available tugs. We've been working on contingency plans. We've put together ports of refuge documents that you're talking about here. We've been talking about dispersants policy. We do marine firefighting symposiums, and have paid for, using NUCA, hundreds and hundreds of geographic response strategies and geographic response plans. And all of those aren't sort of by being belligerent and being standalone. Those are by, working with industry, even when industry doesn't want to work with us, and working with agencies, even when agencies don't want to work with us, because we got a place at the table. And so that's the importance of citizen oversight. You deserve a voice. You deserve a part in this discussion, because you have the most to pay. You as citizens, as stakeholders, you bear the brunt. So that's really important. There we go.
I wasn't sure. I didn't want to cut you off. You had some time. There you go. Now we'll invite Stafford to provide another perspective on citizen oversight and community engagement. 10 minutes, Stafford.
Okay. Thank you very much. Just a little bit of a preface to this, my discussion or debate is that I'm really not speaking on behalf of industry or government or any association or non-government organization. This is sort of a societal reflection that anybody within those groups or sitting at this table may share or may not share. So I'm not trying to target any particular group. The other factor, too, is that I've been on a citizen advisory committee, the Pacific Regional Advisory Committee of Transport Canada for 3 years, and now my tenure was not renewed, and we've got people like Russ Jones and some other caliber people could test the waters and see how well that organization works. So I do volunteer and lean towards the advisory committee and public engagement side of things. That being said, I am going to be taking an advocacy role here. And I want to put on two focal areas here on where we look at community engagements. One is on oversight in the marine vessel casualty risk mitigation side of things, like do we have safe shipping? Do we have the aids navigation? We have everything else. Do we have a safe system at a regional level, not the IMO level type of thing? And then the next is looking at the preparedness and response, and that gets into the incident management side of things. How do we get community engagement in the command, operations, planning, logistics sides under the ICS system? So those are really two focal points that you could look at community engagements coming in. One of the objectives here is that that I want to show, and working with Mark, my esteemed colleague here, is that there's a lot of polarization going on. We're very, very passionate about what we do well. The shipping industry does well in safe shipping, the regulatory industry saying providing that regulatory oversight, the passion of protecting this valuable coastal resources that communities and First Nations rely on. We have this huge passion, but it's a polarized passion. We're at both ends and one end. And one of the things that will come out of my short little debate here is just why do we have this passion? What comes out of this? So I'm working towards showing how much there could be a divergence between where Mark goes and what I'm saying. So here's my discussion. First of all, let's define what is a community. Do we want to be looking at it globally? Will we talk about response community and there's fire, police, ambulance, spill response contractors, and all this kind of stuff? Are we looking at a local community, like just the Haida First Nations, or collectively what's on the island? So there's this idea of this, it's sort of an amorphous blob. What's the community? You know, nobody's defined what's community. So we got to struggle with that first, just even before we get into what community engagement. So of course, the next part of the equation is what's engagement? Are you passive? Do you want to step back and watch what's going on? Or do you really want to get into the weeds and the mud and work with it? And that passive engagement is a very time-consuming investment. The more you're involved in it, the more you're going to have to invest your time away from everything else you do to get involved in it. And people have already discovered that with my work. When I give presentations, I wear them out about, if you want to know this business, hang on, because here it goes. Okay? So why should marine vessel casualty risk mitigation, preparedness, and response be a democratic process anyways? I mean, there's a rhetorical question there. When we have in Canada ample institutional arrangements and avenues right now, we have the International Maritime Organization, we have industry user groups, we have laws, we have standards, you know, package all this kind of stuff. So what's the problem here? You know, why we have that? But and you know, when we have this, you sort of break the question: why do I want to put this investment in? You know, we have all these institutional arrangements now. If the end product of all this aspect, and I'm talking again the risk mitigation, safe navigation, if the end product is safe shipping and emergency preparedness, that really is really what matters, right? We've got that. Do we have safe shipping? We have emergency. Does that really matter? Right. So one of the ways you could argue that point a little bit further, going into the weeds, is that a major vessel casualty on this coast is such a low probability that there is really no business case to invest in community engagement. You know, especially when the community engagement is so ambiguous and poorly defined and delineated. So you got to put if you have such a low probability event, and the only time you ever get engagement is when you have a near miss, you have to ask that question: well, how much? Where's the business case to make this investment? And you could carry that argument a little bit further in the saying that there's a statistical aspect to this. If the statistical risk function is probability, it resonates with that capital and other things like capital investments in expensive things like emergency rescue tugs and regionally based salvage capability doesn't show a business case. The probability is still low to make that business case. Okay? And I don't want to go down the path of Mark Twain, who said, you know, on statistics that, you know, when you talk about statistics, there's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics. I do believe in statistics. So that's sort of the leaning of trying to say, if you're looking at community engagement, You got to know what communities are. You have to know what engagements are. You have to reflect on it and say, make a business case for it. And the business case is because you're going to use up a lot of time and energy to be engaged. Are you going to get a good return for your money? Are you going to get good bang for your buck? The other thing, too, is that we sort of have to face it that, you know, some of these events that have happened worldwide, whether it's the Exxon Valdez or the Trade Tower terrorist incident or the 2008 stock market crash, which really kind of hurt me, actually, personally, are really anomalies. They're black swans, you know, so they are anomalies in the grand scheme of how we run our business in this world. So we have to think about it that way, too. Back to community engagements. It's difficult to tease out the representative and versus the participation in community engagements. We get representation. I'll use an example. If you're a part of an advisory, are you a representative which you're elected by a council, a mayor, or another deputy minister, say representation, or are you there just to participate and provide perspectives? So you have to come up with a governance model to delineate that role. You have to come up with with a role to say, how do I delineate the area that I want to be involved in? You know, the plan. Is it this box or that box? Or do you draw a line? And so you got a delineator where that oversight will occur. So that's a lot of work to do. That's the protocols and governance models that go with it. And memorandums of understandings that have to be put through. That's a lot of work. So you got to wonder whether or not your community engagement is worthwhile the investment. Also, we got to look at. So what my view is then, so just we've got the institutional arrangements. Leave it to the experts. You know, certainly was echoed in the tanker panel, expert panel on tanker safety. It says, put it to the experts. Leave it to the experts. They didn't want the Pacific Regional Advisory Committees. They think they're lay people. Leave it to the experts. Well, I'm going to lean to that. I mean, we got our master mariners. They've got all the certificates and shipboard plans and experience. They should know, you know, what they're doing. They spend a lot of time gazing over the horizon day in and day out, looking at navigational charts. And then working with the scientists, with the knowledge and peer reviews to do their jobs, and they've shaken up oil and flasks to look at weathering, so they must know what's going on. And we got the regulatory agencies with a lot of regulatory authority and tools to do their job. So I say we just, you know, leave it to the experts. If you want community engagement on the areas of marine risk, mitigation, and safe navigation, just get down and meet and greet these people. Pick up the phone. And if you really want to take it, just go to the internet and read the thing and read about what's going on. I got 2 minutes left here. I'm going to talk about the next part. We're now into the piece where my papers have gone backwards here, so hang on here. This is not good when I got only 2 minutes left.
The clock is ticking.
Incident management. One of the things with incident management, there are two approaches to community engagements and incident management. One is looking from the outside inside or looking from the inside out. And you've got to ask that question. Do you want to be in part of this business of incident management, command and control? One is being passive if you're looking in, the other one is actually actively engaged. Tremendous amount of training if you want to be actively engaged, tremendous amount of time and commitment that goes with it. Again, there needs to be, defining what that community engagement is and what the define is. And it's going to change. Are you going to be part of that community engagement when it's an escalating event, or are you going to be part of that community engagement when there's a long, like an escalating event where we need to talk about a drifting vessel and places of refuge and where you're going to put your nearshore booms, or do you want to be involved in a long, protracted shoreline cleanup where there's a debris field from containers or oil? You get different types of community engagements and different types of commitment that goes with it. In the way of looking at the escalating stuff, you put your community engagements well in advance on places of refuge and geographic response plans and signing them off and reviewing it and be collective and collaboration of it. Tremendous amount of work that goes with it. Since I only about a minute left here, what I'm trying to advocate there is that what we should be looking at is in the end, do you want to have a racehorse where you have one person in charge, limited amount of environmental and community engagement, says they're going, and they know their objectives to get into the racetrack at the very end, very simple, very linear, or do you want a camel where you come back and it's aimlessly wandering around the desert wondering what to go. And you've got to remember, what's the definition of a camel? It's a racehorse put together by a committee. So, so what I would say is that in the end, when it comes to emergency management, less engagement is better. Really harsh.
Stafford referred to this as a possible career ender, and I'd like to thank him for a valiant effort. Mark, I'd like you to address why a community is not a camel. 3 minutes.
Okay. All right. First of all, that's the command and control issue. That's the camel, and, just let us, be efficient and be in charge and large and in charge. And I would say diversity is a strength and not a weakness. The other argument you heard is trust us. Don't worry your pretty little heads. We have the expertise and we're looking out for your best interests. Well, I'm here to tell you the devil's in the details. Benchmark against the best practices and the best way to do things. Not the most expedient or the cheapest example. You go back to the SALT II treaty, trust but verify. And so the other, what's the business case? Why should industry pay to get beat up or shut down or fund an anti-industry voice? Well, we're not anti-industry. We're actually very cheap insurance, a social license to operate with balanced perspectives. And so the argument he didn't say, but you hear a lot, is oil industry, shipping industry doesn't want an accident just as much as the people don't. Yeah, okay, I agree with that. You know what we don't agree about? Yeah, we understand the consequences and just how grim they can be, and we understand them intimately and have a much more informed idea about where the balance is and should be, what should be done, and frankly, how much ought to be spent to prevent the next accident. The other thing you hear is, oh, industry's got a great safety record, and they do in some cases. But I'm here to tell you there's a big difference between process safety and personal safety. Personal safety is easy to manage. You don't wear a hard hat, we fire you. You talk on the cell phone while you're driving, we fire you. You know what's difficult and hard to pay for and doesn't happen? You got a pipeline that's rusting through. Let's run another 3 years. You got a refinery process that needs to be upgraded. Maybe we can get another 10 years out of that. You got a ship that's old and tired. We keep operating it. He asked about, what do we do in spill response roles as communities, inside and outside the incident management team, outside independent monitoring, a voice you can trust, not spin from the responsible party. Inside the incident management team, the environmental unit, you bring expertise, local knowledge, traditional knowledge. You know what's there, you know when it's there, you know what it's vulnerable to. Regional Stakeholders Committee, giving local leaders, local communities access to the incident management team, to the unified command. A liaison role, a local on-scene coordinator. So people have posited that citizens advisory groups could be local on-scene coordinators. And there's a role for citizens in preparedness as well. Drill monitoring, evaluation, planning, best available and safest technology evaluation and promotions. Plan review, looking at sufficiency of plans so you don't have walruses in the plan where there aren't walruses, proficiency, capability, hazard risk analysis, getting a bunch of worried people in the room, like that worried parent in the back of the car. All the experts out there, folks that used to work for industry that know what could go wrong and how it could go wrong and what's not being done to stop it. And so folks that have a real understanding of incident consequences. All right, so they can talk about social consequences and coping with technological disasters and those kind of things. There's a real role for citizens in spill response. There's a real role for citizens in preparedness. And those arguments, trust us, command and control, the camel, they fall flat. Diversity is a strength, not a weakness.
Stafford, you have the last word here. We want to know why we should trust you.
Wow, Mark used up a lot of my time, so I'm just going to keep it really short here. Mark, you said, the citizen advisory group that you were with, there's a wet blanket, which gives us this image of really quite smothering, damp, and cold, kind of yucky. But, I will acknowledge that it will keep everybody awake. I agree with that. You also said that you're not a watchdog or a lapdog, but still a god. I'm sorry, I'm dyslexic here, a dog. I will acknowledge, though, that it can come and bites a person and reminds everybody they're still alive and well and you're being watched over. So I like to acknowledge that I've been totally defeated and I am humbled by you, Mark. Thank you very much.